Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about secularism, or more accurately, the history of secularism and militant atheism. This is a topic that's always been fascinating to me, and I have recently been doing an extensive study of it, but I'm not complete enough to do a formal series on the topic. I hope to in the future. For now, I am releasing this video to both YouTube and to the Shoot of Bit. If you don't know what the Shoot of Bit is, please keep in mind I have to speak in euphemisms to avoid the certain issues that crop up due to YouTube being controlled by Al Gore and his rhythm. So, there is a certain movement and personality that drove that movement that is important to the development of the history that we have, whose name gets people who are determined to be conservative flagged by the two of you. And it goes along with the mythos that they have today about that certain someone being a right-winger and a conservative force, and along with the supposed threat of a Christian nationalism, which is synonymous at this point with white Christian nationalists, because apparently all Christian nationalists are white and are racist. This is, however, a bit of an odd problem, because the members of the self-declared skeptic community, as well as the media, tend to work together in a way that is understandable if you know social dynamics. It's not, however, something that can be easily understood as a traditional conspiracy theory. However, it is also not simply developmental. There are people who gather in the proverbial smoky back rooms. They don't have to be literal smoky back rooms. They could be nice hotels and conference centres or office suites. But there are people who are promoting certain ideals and beliefs to reshape society. This is not really a conspiracy theory, although it will likely be dismissed as such. It is rather open and well known, and all of the facts that I use to derive this conclusion can be looked up online for free, and when I do my formal series I will be rather thorough and systematic in presenting that evidence. Here I will mention a few sources. This video is not going to be as long as all that. It's one video and it is not the formal series, but it is something I wish to talk about because I want to get my channel back up and running. It isn't the only topic I wish to discuss though. However, I have released several videos, some of which on time delay, to test certain speech patterns that I shall be using to evade Al Gore, as to not disturb his rhythm. So, I spent 3 days basically going over the same basic information, using various different speech patterns and techniques, and the last part of that test is actually going to show up later next year, because I have put it on scheduling so that I can determine how Al Gore views them, and how he determines whether or not they're acceptable to his rhythm or disruptive to Al Gore's rhythm, if you know what I mean. However, that is actually a large part of what makes this video so prescient now, because, believe it or not, the new atheism brought nothing new several years ago, and as much as people now claim the new atheism is dead, the fact of the matter is it's not. The new atheism is a brand name that has become tarnished. But you still see members in the self-declared skeptic community using the same arguments and promoting the same beliefs. And as much as they claim they don't have beliefs, they merely lack belief in a god, because all members of the skeptic community are, of course, atheists, because only an atheist can be a skeptic, since religious people can't be, and even though they will assure you they are not equating theism to religion, they will nevertheless act as if a theist is religious and an atheist is not. Here's the thing. The skeptic community, as it calls itself, is actually a community of pseudo-skeptics who promote secular humanism. Many of them deny this, and some, I'm sure, don't realize they are secular humanists. They've never actually joined a secular humanist organization or what have you. But they do listen to atheist YouTube channels. They do read atheist blogs, and they do read atheist websites, and many of them will read atheist books, and consume various other media that you may present. And quite contrary to their insistence that atheism is a mere lack of belief in a god, not even a belief that God doesn't exist, but a lack of belief in a god, nothing more, nothing less, and that atheism is nothing more than an answer to a single question, and that atheists have nothing in common with each other but a lack of belief in a god, you will nevertheless see all of the atheist YouTube channels, or BitChute channels, or various other channels on the internet in video sharing sites, or you'll see the same blogs and websites and books, all making the same points, all referencing the same information, and all talking the same way. This latter point they always ignore. They actually have a pre-scripted response when someone like me points that out. That pre-scripted response is to tell you that had it ever occurred to you that it could be different people arriving at the same conclusion independently based upon the same evidence? They act as if it never occurred to me that it could just be that these people are saying it because it's true, and they individually did research and came to this conclusion, or learned the truth and are presenting it. It never occurred to me because, as a religious person, I don't do my own research. I just go to church, and my pastor and church elders and leaders tell me what to think. That is, of course, what they're saying. But in reality, it's fairly obvious that it's not really true, that they are simply doing their own research and arriving at an independent, separate conclusion that happens to agree. And it's for a point that they never address, and that is linguistics. Or, to use a blatantly obvious example, I'm not going to believe if I have a conversation with 150 atheists, and the first atheist compares God to a flying spaghetti monster, specifically, and the second atheist compares God to a flying spaghetti monster, and the third atheist compares God to a flying spaghetti monster, up until 150. That all 150 atheists that I have spoken to in that period of time, that is, of course, hypothetical, individually invented a flying spaghetti monster. And of course, it's not 150. At this point, there's several, and they even created a parody religion, Pastafarianism, and they have this cute little prayer that they use to make fun of prayer, to make it seem ridiculous, just as ridiculous as believing a god exists, where they say, "May his noodly appendages bless you. Ramen." Isn't it funny? They replaced the word amen with ramen. Ha ha ha. Here's the thing, though. The more atheists I see repeating the Pastafarian prayer, "May his noodly appendages bless you," ramen, the more I find it difficult to believe that each one of those people individually created the flying spaghetti monster, individually created a parody religion based on the flying spaghetti monster, individually decided to call this parody religion Pastafarianism, and individually came up with the prayer, "May his noodly appendages bless you," ramen. it's fairly obvious that they are in fact quoting it from some other source, and that the reason you see all 150 of my hypothetical atheists saying the same thing is because they saw other atheists do it. And incidentally, the example I used is not hypothetical. Rather, you do see many atheists talking about the flying spaghetti monster. You do see them using the flying spaghetti monster to depict the idea of God as ridiculous and people who believe in God as stupid. You do see many of them using the Pastafarian religion. You do see many of them repeating that same prayer. May his noodly appendages bless you, ramen, word for word the same. I'm not going to believe that they came up with that on their own, based on their own research. Just like I'm not going to believe them saying that God is unfair in Christianity because he sends you to hell, and hell is infinite punishment for finite crimes, and infinite punishment for finite crimes is immoral, and pretend they're not getting this from the atheist experience. I'm not going to pretend that this isn't a quote from Matt Dillahunty. It is a quote from Matt Dillahunty. I'm not going to pretend when one of them says that atheism is not a religion, atheism is a lack of belief in a god, atheism is a religion like bald is a hair color, that they are not quoting Sam Harris. I'm not going to pretend that when they make a slight alteration to this quote, or rather, when they quote someone else's alteration to it, that it's any different either. And the self-declared skeptic community has modified Sam Harris's quote, partly simply because people pointed out that what Sam Harris said is technically wrong. Bald could actually be considered a hair color since, well, for one thing, no one is ever completely bald, and for another, you could still classify it as such. So they came up with alternatives, but the second reason they came up with alternatives is simply to pretend they're not just quoting Sam Harris. But they are, they're just substituting the example, but it's still ultimately a quote from Sam Harris, even though it's been modified. And when you see them say, atheism is not a religion, atheism is a lack of belief in a god, atheism is a religion, like not playing sports as a sport, they're quoting other atheists who have altered Sam Harris's quote. The same goes for, atheism is not a religion, atheism is a lack of belief in a god, atheism is a religion, like not collecting stamps is a hobby. I've become known in the atheist community, the same atheist community that calls itself the skeptic community, will all uniformly claim that Christianity is bad for people's mental health. And this is because Christians teach that you can just pray away your problems, and if you're having mental health problems, it's because you're not believing hard enough or don't believe in the right things, but mostly not believing hard enough. You're not praying hard enough, and you just need to work harder, and if you fail, it's because you're choosing to sin, and this creates people's anxieties. It actually makes their anxieties worse. It makes their depression worse. It makes their fears worse. People are living in fear of hell because they're failing to live up to what God demanded. Their anxieties and depression increases. Christianity is an evil religion because it hurts people's mental health by telling disabled people they just need to work harder. And of course, religion allows you to bypass common human empathy, and all morals come from empathy. Atheists who have no religion are empathetic in kind, and even though society cruelly depicts atheists as evil and Christians depict them as pure evil, atheists are actually kind and loving, whilst Christians are not. Christians claim, of course, to be loving, but they do things that are very hurtful and damaging. After all, there is no hate like Christian love. These are the same atheists who will then turn around, pointing out that Christians, like me, ridicule the disabled and say, you just need to work harder. We follow a religion that actually hurts people's mental health by causing them to internalize shame and fear and guilt. We create deeper anxieties and depressions and fear in people, and the religion is just evil, and that atheists are so much better and would never, ever, ever mock the disabled, will then make fun of me because of my bad grammar. You see, when I type with random capitals, and I do this because I'm an idiot. Either that or I'm drunk. But let's face it, it's probably both. I'm probably an alcoholic who drinks heavily before posting, and I went to Christian homeschool, I never learned proper grammar, and I type with random capitals. And they all love making fun of me for that, and point out how my random capitals proves that I have no credibility, since I'm obviously an idiot and an alcoholic. Here's the problem, though. Even though I'm an alcoholic who's typing while drunk and needs to stop drinking when I type, and even though I'm an idiot who doesn't have proper grammar, I do know that randomly capitalizing words is not a grammatical issue, but is rather a syntax issue, which is one thing they never seem to learn because they prefer to say I have bad grammar, and probably don't know what the word syntax means. And they won't know what it means if they just do that cute little thing where they go to a dictionary either, because simply reading something isn't the same as understanding it. Incidentally, I don't actually randomly capitalize words. I capitalize nouns, modifiers, and certain key terms. And I do this because I am legally blind and dyslexic. And I have told the self-declared, empathetic, kind, and compassionate skeptic community this before. You see, by using the typing conventions that I use, I am able to focus on the words better and make fewer spelling mistakes. Being dyslexic, making spelling mistakes is common, and being legally blind, it doesn't help matters since I can't easily reread the posts. So, I developed a system to which I can more easily type. It is based on an older English convention. I did not say Old English. Old English is not what I'm basing it on directly. Although Middle and Early Modern English did come from Old English and ultimately do derive from the German, which is where I'm actually basing my typing conventions on. It is based on a form of English that was closer to German that helps my eyes focus. It is not identical to it, but it is based on it. And it helps my eyes to focus, and it's a way for me to compensate for certain disabilities. They know this. I have explained it several times. It does not matter. They still make fun of me for randomly capitalizing words and telling me that this means that I have no credibility. In reality, very little of what you see in the self-declared skeptic community is the product of individual effort. The self-declared skeptics are really nothing more than mindless atheist drones, repeating a series of pre-scripted, rehearsed statements that they whip out and throw at you so that they can basically dismiss what you're saying. And they have a lot of these excuses, like accusing people of doing the Gish Gallop, which they will no doubt accuse me of doing in this video, because I am going to need to supply them evidence. And you see, while they claim their biggest problem with religion and religious people is that they never present evidence, and that is in fact the difference between an atheist and a religious person. If you ask a religious person what they base their beliefs on, they will simply say faith, and they will never show you evidence. If you ask an atheist, they will always show you evidence. In reality, the atheist never shows you evidence. They retreat to the atheism is defined as a lack of belief in a god, not a belief in a lack of a god. Atheists do not believe there is no god. Atheists merely lack belief. Atheists make no claims. Atheists have no burden of proof. And as much as they like saying this is an opinion only on one question, whether or not God exists, the same mentality of having no burden of proof is used for any situation that they're in. It is always the religious person who has the burden of proof, no matter what is being discussed, and no matter who said what. That is why when an atheist makes a historical claim, we must accept the historical claim as true and as the default position until the religious person proves them wrong. Thus, for example, if they claim the Christian Church was invented by Constantine, or at the very least the Church as we understand it, and that at the Council of Nicaea we got the Christian Bible, where people chose what books to go in and removed books they didn't like, which is odd because if the Nicene Council is what created the Bible, how can you remove books from it? But in their mind it's both. The Bible did not exist until the Council of Nicaea, when it was invented by having people put books in, but they also removed books from the Bible, which at the time didn't exist, so and people were deciding what books went into it. Nevertheless, at the Council of Nicaea, people determined the canon of the Bible, and they came up with all sorts of beliefs that we now associate with Christianity, like the Trinity, Jesus being God, things like that. And it was all done under Emperor Constantine, who was merging paganism with Christianity and all sorts of other things like that. If they make that sort of claim, well, it's just history, and if you say otherwise, you're making the claim that it's not true, and you are the one with the burden of proof. The atheist who told you that this was what happened has made no claims and has no burden of proof. They don't usually say it that way because they realize, even in their dim intellect, that this wouldn't really be sensible. But they nevertheless act this way. They'll say things like, "I'm not here to do your homework for you," or "Do your own research," or "History tells me I'm right," or "You should learn history. Pick up a history book." Things along those lines. And as you will notice, just as I'm making my video choppy, specifically to avoid the tube of you and the wrath of Al Gore, who hates his rhythm disrupted, you will actually notice that ultimately the atheist never actually proves anything with evidence. Even when they make a specific historical claim, they never provide evidence. Or at the very least, seldom do. And normally when they do show evidence, it's fake. A good example of that would be a quote from Seneca they love. Supposedly, Seneca said, "Religion is regarded by the wise as false, by the fool as true, and by the ruler as useful." In reality, Seneca never said this. And it doesn't matter who did say it. It isn't really a statement they can prove is true either. They simply rely on it being from Seneca, as if that means anything, as if we should simply believe it because Seneca said it, even though they will condemn Christians or religious people for doing exactly that. And yet they will provide neither evidence that the quote is actually from Seneca, nor will they actually provide evidence that it is actually true. You have to prove them wrong instead. And one of the biggest lies that they like telling is that atheism has no history, aside from the fact that there have always been people who lack belief in a god. And since atheism is a lack of belief, it does not motivate people who would do something in the name of what they don't believe. Well, the very fact that they themselves have made their identity around being atheists, and they listen to atheist YouTube channels, and they associate atheism with reason and belief in science, and this idea that there's a conflict, a war, in fact, between science and religion, and that religious people reject science and believe in religion, and that atheists reject religion and believe in science, and that they equate science and atheism to certain specific political and social and moral ideals, as well as an understanding of the world being material. It is silly to say it's just an opinion on one topic and one topic only, and that they have nothing in common with other atheists besides a lack of belief in a god. I'm really not saying what they think I'm saying, though. They will always accuse me of saying I'm generalizing all atheists, and I'm not. I'm just not pretending the modern-day self-declared skeptic community is a group of people who merely lack belief in a god. I'm not pretending that there is no atheist movement that is in reality a secular humanist movement, which gets me back to the point. Many, perhaps even most now, will deny being secular humanists, while listening to people who openly are secular humanists, or else became atheists through listening to secular humanists, and who are saying exactly the same thing, to the point where They have all the same beliefs of a secular humanist, and yet we are supposed to consider them as something other than a secular humanist, even though they collaborate and work with other people who have the same beliefs they do, and all promote the same social and political situation. And they do so in a way that they complain, in America at least, that churches do and claim is illegal, and that is to run 501c charities which openly advocate for political candidates and political causes. Many of them, however, have taken on this bizarre idea that there is a law in America that says religious institutions cannot get involved in politics. Their tax exemption is in fact dependent on it, and churches that get involved in politics should be stripped of their tax exemption. They are breaking the law. Some even think this is what the First Amendment says and requires, that the First Amendment says churches are not allowed to speak on political matters. And it ties very nicely with the mythology that they have, and it is a mythology, that America's founders created a secular republic based on secularism, because they looked at Europe and the centuries of wars caused by religion, and how when religions took over societies, people had no freedoms because the laws were all written by religious leaders who conformed to religion, and people were not free. There was constant warfare. Women, midwives, helping women give birth, were burned at the stake as witches, and all this horrible thing. And the founding fathers realized how horrible religion was and created separation of church and state to protect the liberty of the government from religion, to prevent the government from being corrupted and taken over by religion, and thus to protect the people from the tyranny that was created by religion when it mixes with politics. This is, of course, not real history. America's founders did not fear religion taking over government and creating a tyranny stripping people of their rights. They actually feared the government and its power taking over religion, which makes far more sense, considering that this is exactly what happened after the Protestant Reformation. National churches in Europe were not churches that were running the government and in charge of it, but were rather controlled by the government. All one has to do is look at Henry VIII and how he implemented his Church of England. And I say that because there's another historical myth that's popular, that Henry VIII founded the Church of England. This is only partially true. The truth is that after Edward died, Edward was Henry's only son, and he became king very, very, very briefly. After he died, Mary ascended to the throne. Mary was the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and she actually returned the Church of England to Catholicism. The modern Church of England actually began with Queen Elizabeth. But it doesn't really matter. By the way, when I say Queen Elizabeth, I mean Queen Elizabeth the First. But it doesn't really matter. Because according to the mythos, when you mix church and state, the church takes over the state, and people lose their freedoms because religious leaders control it, and in the parlance of today, you have a theocracy where religion runs the government and there is no freedom. What actually happened, though, is that Henry took over the church, not the church, the parliament. And even during Elizabeth, the Queen took over the church. And even to this day in England, the church cannot completely run itself. Rather, there's a board of church governors within Parliament, and this legal body has to give final approval on any major changes that happens within the Church of England. To illustrate this point, back in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s range, the various churches within the Anglican Communion, who are, by the way, separate churches, they are simply in communion with Canterbury in a sort of union that I will one day explain in greater detail, but they each have their own internal policies and administrations that run largely autonomously. And during the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, people began wishing to update the Book of Common Prayer, and you had many of them do so. In America, for instance, in the American Episcopal Church, released a new prayer book in 1979. And in roughly the same time, the mid to late 1970s, early 1980s range, most of the churches within the Anglican Communion, especially within the English-speaking world, updated their Book of Common Prayer to some degree. There were some people in America, for instance, that did not like the revisions and continued to use the 1928 prayer book, which, while itself was a revision of the 1662, was much more mild and much closer to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer used by the Church of England. However, the Church of England did not change its official prayer book, and officially to this day still uses the 1662. This is not, however, because the church governance wished to do so. In fact, the church governance in England also wished to update its book and put forward several alternatives, including a prototype book of Common Prayer for a revised Book of Common Prayer. And the Board of Governors in England told them they could not implement it. They had to maintain the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. They tried for years to resolve the situation, since many wanted to update the Book of Common Prayer. Some said that they would actually have two. They could keep the 1662 and have another, but the Board of Governors shot that down. They finally came up with a solution that was passed by the board. To be fair, at this point it's probably different people, where officially the 1662 Book of Common Prayer remains the official prayer book for the Church of England, but they were allowed to use the alternative service book. And later, the alternative service book, which was a prototype, was itself revised and became the Book of Common Worship. Legally, and in theory, the Book of Common Prayer is the official prayer book of the Church of England that they use for Mass, and as a supplement to the 1662, some parishes may use the Book of Common Worship instead, which sounds like the majority would use the 1662, but really most use the Book of Common Worship. However, it took a long time to get there, and they are still required to officially use the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and the 1662 is mandated for use in certain situations. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because, ultimately, the Church of England is not allowed to change its own prayer book without the approval of Parliament. And the self-declared skeptic community claims when you mix religion and politics, religion takes over politics and creates tyranny as the church tells you what to do. And I can point to other historical examples. For instance, many within the self-declared skeptic community were angered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, because he made overtures toward the gay and lesbian community and wished to bless same-sex marriages within the Church of England. People like Hemet Mehta, the self-declared friendly atheist, and others were appalled by the fact that many in the media, or even across the internet, were praising him for this. And they pointed out that he's not really a friend of gay people, and neither is the Church of England, since they haven't changed their official teachings. They still teach that being gay is a sin. They still won't actually perform same-sex marriages. And if they really wanted to show that they had changed, they would change what the church teaches, and they would perform same-sex marriages. This, of course, put at ease the tension in the atheist community, since they love pointing out that Christians hate gay people, and that's one of the ways Christians are bigoted. They hate gays. Well, obviously, if someone's saying they don't, you have to set them straight and point out that they really do. And the Church of England does not perform same-sex marriages, and has not changed its official teaching on sexuality. Therefore, Welby is simply talking out of both sides of his mouth to look good, but really he's just as bigoted a homophobe as ever, and so is the Church of England. The problem with this argument is that in England there is a law that says that neither the Church of England nor the Catholic Church are legally allowed to perform same-sex marriages. While this isn't a problem for the Catholic Church because they don't want to do so anyway, it does mean that the Church of England cannot simply change its teachings and start performing same-sex marriages because they are not legally allowed to do so. What's more, even if that law were to change and they would treat the Church of England and the Catholic Church like they do other religious bodies who are allowed to perform same-sex marriages but are not compelled to, the Church of England still couldn't perform same-sex marriages unless Parliament approved of the change in their doctrine. So, first, they would have to change the law in England that would allow them to perform the same-sex marriage. Then they would have to get authorization for that change through the Board of Church Governors. Now, one may say that if Parliament was willing to change the law, then certainly they would be willing to allow them to change their beliefs and official policies. But you have to remember, the people who run the Board of Church Governors, the Church Commissioners in Parliament, are not always the same as everyone else in Parliament. So it may not actually happen that way. Even if they were to change the actual law, the Church Commissioners may still stay with their own position, and the Church would be powerless to change it otherwise. So, while people like Hamet Mehta will condemn them for not changing their beliefs and point out that they're still homophobes, he's really not being fair to them. But that's the point. You see, the modern-day self-declared skeptic community is really just a bigoted, anti-Christian hate movement. And as much as they talk about reason, free thought, science, critical thinking, all you ever see them talk about is how awful and evil and irrational Christians are, and how the Christian religion makes no sense, and how it's horrible and how it's harmful to people. That's all they ever talk about. They only talk about how evil Christians are. Even when they talk about other religions like Islam, they will always bring it back to Christianity somehow. Like saying, oh, Islam is evil. The Prophet Muhammad was a pedophile. He was a rapist and a murderer. He was a terrible sociopath. Look how stupid that is. Look how stupid this thing in the Quran is. But it's still not as bad as in the Christian Bible. Jesus tells his followers to hate their parents and to kill people who won't convert. Christianity is still worse than Islam. They will always do it like that. And please don't assume that what I just said is an indictment on Islam. I really don't have a problem with Muslims. The point that I'm trying to make is that Islam is the religion that they most focus on if they don't focus on Christianity. And even then, they will always add attacks on Christianity to their attacks on Islam. But 99% of the time these days, it's about Christianity. And even after 9/11, 90% of the time it was about Christianity. And it's very obvious even when they try and generalize it by using the word religion or theist instead of Christian, that they're really just talking about Christians. I've actually heard them say things like, religious people teach you that the Bible is the Word of God. Religion defines faith as belief without evidence. We can prove that because the Bible definition of faith is found in Hebrews 11:1. Religion teaches that you need Jesus to be your savior. You can find atheists making these claims. But here's the question that I have to ask you then. Why do they say all these things? It's pretty obvious that they are using scripted dialogue. And they never quite admit that. They never actually admit that the fact that they are word for word or at the very least, very closely matching word-for-word quotes, proves that they are not just looking at the evidence independently and arriving at the same conclusions. They never admit that point. And they never admit the other point that is also important to note. And that is that a lot of the things they say are simply wrong. For example, they will say that Mussolini, forgive the euphemism, was a devout Catholic. And they have a list, just like they do with other people. But I'm not making the point primarily about Mussolini. So I'm only going to use one example. To prove that he was a Catholic and that he believed in the Catholic faith, they will say that he got married in a Catholic church, in a Catholic chapel. This isn't true. He actually got married by a judge. He was married by a justice of the peace. So, when they claim he was married in a church, they're simply lying. You see the same thing when they talk about a certain man with a funny mustache, Mr. Lear. Euphemism. They will claim that he was a devout Catholic. He had the full support of the Catholic Church for his Socialist for Nationalism party. And they will claim that one of his heroes was Martin Luther. Which makes no sense if he was a devout Catholic, but they don't really stop and think that because they're just lumping all Christians together, even though they claim they're not. And none of this is really true. A good example of that would be them pointing to a quote he said to a certain general, whose name I'm going to butcher deliberately. Eagleton S. In 1941, where he said, "I am now Catholic and will always remain so." Sounds rather convincing, except for the fact that Mr. Learhis never actually said that. And you see a lot of these examples thereabout. And the reason they say all these things is because there have been dedicated organizations that have been promoting these ideas. Like the American Humanist Association, like the Council for Secular Humanism, which later merged with another organization that pushed these ideas, the Richard Dawkins Foundation. That became the Center for Inquiry. The Center for Inquiry inherits, however, the library and references from the Council for Secular Humanism, and the claims that you see being promoted by the Council for Secular Humanism. Are still on the Center for Inquiry. American Atheists is another such organization, or the Atheist Experience and the Atheist Community of Houston. You have the National Secular Society in the United Kingdom. You have International Humanists, and so on. There's the Freedom from Religion Foundation as well, which is something that we should note. All of them, however, are intra-related. For example, the Council for Secular Humanism actually broke off of the American Humanist Association. But since it's split from the American Humanist Association, they have collaborated on certain other issues, especially with political reform. And therein lies the problem, because remember what I said earlier? They will say that churches are breaking the law by getting involved in politics and by being engaged in political advocacy and should be stripped of their tax exemption. This is because the atheist community does not understand the law. Some of them actually think the First Amendment of the Constitution makes this a necessity, because they think America's founders feared religion taking over government, when in reality they feared the government taking over religion. And James Madison made that very clear in his remonstrance in Virginia, which they will often quote as proof that he was not a Christian and that he feared Christian takeover and all that, which, if you actually read the document, he didn't. And do keep in mind, I am butchering the name of that as well. Again, with certain apologies. But the point I'm making is this. In their minds, it is against the law in America for any church to be tax exempt and speak on politics, at the very least. Many think it's against the law for churches to speak on politics at all. But some would say, as a condition of tax exemption, they cannot speak on politics. And that it's wrong to do so. And yet, atheist organizations speak on politics all the time. But the atheist community would either completely ignore this point, many of them may even be unaware of it, even though it's hard to believe that since the very channels and websites they're on make it very clear they're politically activists. But most of them would dismiss it by pointing out a very simple fact. The law says religious bodies will lose their tax exemption if they get involved in politics. But atheist organizations are not religious by definition. Since atheism is not a religion, atheism is a lack of belief in a god. Atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. Nevertheless, these non-stamp collectors, who have nothing in common with each other but their lack of belief in a god, all seem to be pushing the same political agenda on their websites and through their organizations. They seem pretty motivated by atheism, in fact, because they run atheist organizations. And therein lies the problem. You see, according to them, it's against the law for religion to get involved in politics. But atheists, by definition, have no religion. In addition to the obvious fact that they will never address that what they're basically saying is Christians cannot vote according to their actual beliefs and values, and cannot get involved politically based upon those values, but atheists can, and how that is an obvious attempt to shut people out that don't agree with them, the simple reality is that what they're saying is balderdash. For one thing, there is no law in America that says churches must lose their tax exemption if they get involved in politics. The tax codes say that 501c organizations can't. And therein lies the problem. By the way, before you call me an idiot, point out that I have bad grammar because I randomly capitalize words and tell me you don't believe that I know anything about taxes, or worse, I'm a liar for Jeebus. You can look up the tax laws in America online. Strictly speaking, tax policies are not laws. Though they are one of those things that are tricky to explain to people. You are required by law to obey the tax policies, but the tax policies are not themselves laws. That may sound silly because that means that the tax policies have all the force of a law would, but are not laws, but that is the way American law is actually run, at least at the federal level. There are differences at the state level, but for the most part, the law says you must obey the tax codes. But the tax codes are not laws, and are much easier to amend or alter or abolish than a tax code would, than a law would be. Nevertheless, the actual Johnson Amendment, which is what they keep talking about, does not actually say religious bodies are only tax exempt if they do not get involved in politics. If a religious body gets involved in politics, they will be stripped of their tax exemption. Rather, it says that a 501c organization is not tax exempt. A 501c organization need not be a religious organization. What's more, all of the atheist organizations actually do follow a religion called secular humanism. And this is something that many of them will deny, but which is blatantly obviously true, since they will actually say this on their own websites as part of their mission statement. For example, do you remember when I mentioned Hamid Mehta, the self-declared friendly atheist? He is the president of the Secular Student Alliance. On its website, the Secular Student Alliance says that it exists to promote humanist values. The Secular Student Alliance is also an organization under the American Humanist Association, meaning the American Humanist Association is the parent organization for the Secular Student Alliance. Prometheus Press is their printing house, run by the American Humanist Association, by the way. The Secular Student Alliance is also deeply connected to American Atheists and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And in fact, the same parent company that actually owns the American Humanist Association actually owns many of these other organizations, or at least owns shares in them. Hamid Mehta is also part of the Center for Inquiry, which, even though now legally distinct from the American Humanist Association, has once again been subordinated by the same parent company. Interesting fact, isn't it? So they are, however, all very clearly secular humanists. If you look on the Freedom from Religion Foundation site, they will tell you they are promoting humanist values. They don't make it as obvious as the Secular Student Alliance does, but they do. If you go to American Atheists, they promote humanism. And humanism is legally defined as a religion in the United States, meaning that if the law said religious organizations could not get involved in politics, that means the American Humanist Association could not get involved in politics. That would mean the Center for Inquiry could not be involved in politics. The Freedom from Religion Foundation cannot be involved in politics, and yet they are. They're all involved in political activism. If you go to their sites, they will all be very clearly promoting left-wing political views that align with their secular humanism. Keep in mind, my channel is not dedicated to politics. Even though you may see me as a typical Christian fundamentalist who votes Republican and wears my MAGA hat and thinks of Donald Trump as a new messiah, the fact is, I am not that political. However, I am stating a fact when I tell you that the atheist websites, the ones promoting secular humanism, are all anti-Trump. I don't care if you are anti-Trump as my audience. I'm not trying to tell you who to vote for because I am not political. But it is blatantly obvious that the American Humanist Association hates Donald Trump, and even before Trump came along, hated George Bush. They hated Republicans, they hated conservatives, and they argued against various political causes that they claimed conservatives were on. They were, for instance, opposed to the striking down of Roe v. Wade. They were opposed to Bush taking us out of the Kyoto Protocols. They were opposed to Proposition 8 in California several years ago. If you look on their website, they told humanists that they had to vote for Obama, and now they're telling you that you have to support the Democrats, and if that means Biden, you must support Biden, so that Donald Trump and the evil factists don't get back into office. They are very obviously politically active, and they are promoting a religion, at least under the law, whether or not they like the term applied to them or not. But here's the scary part for them. It is ultimately irrelevant if secular humanism is a religion or not, because the actual tax policy in the Johnson Amendment does not say religious bodies are not allowed to get involved in politics. It says 501c organizations aren't allowed to get involved in politics. And this is important because while churches can be 501c, not everything that is 501c is a church or religious organization. It's not like the 501c category in the tax codes exists purely for religion and religious organizations. It actually exists for non-profit, charitable and educational foundations, which includes religious bodies. Yes, I know, it's an oxymoron to say that churches are either charitable or educational. They do nothing but spread fairy tales and lies written by Bronze Age goat herders, and they hoard wealth. We've all heard that nonsense if you are going to tell it to us. They are nevertheless legally classified as charitable, and they are nevertheless legally classified as educational. Regardless of how a member of the self-declared skeptic community feels about them, or what a member of the self-declared skeptic community says they believe about them, that is what they are. And we are talking about law, not someone's personal opinion. Which brings me back to the problem. 501c organizations need not be religious. Even though religious bodies can be 501c, that does not mean all 501c organizations are religious. But all 501c organizations are forbidden by law from engaging in political activism. Meaning, the atheist organizations that I just mentioned are breaking the law. It is irrelevant that they don't want you to know this. They are hypocrites when they complain about churches doing this. Especially since they will complain if any church gets involved in political activism. You see, the other dirty little secret here is churches do not need to file to become a 501c organization to exist. Now, an atheist may agree with that, but they'd say, that means they're paying taxes. No, it doesn't. Churches and other religious bodies are tax exempt automatically. This is not something that is exclusive for Christian churches either. Jewish organizations and synagogues are tax exempt. Muslim mosques and madrasas are tax exempt. And the American Humanist Association is tax exempt. However, there are certain reasons why a church may decide to become 501c. The primary reason that most would list is so that donations to them can become tax deductible. There are, of course, other benefits to being 501c that are listed in law that, since this video is not primarily about that, I'm going to simply lay aside. I may go into it in detail later on. But here is the point. A church is tax exempt whether or not it is 501c. The main difference from practical everyday reality that most people face is that if you go to a church that is 501c and you donate money, that money that you donate to your church is tax deductible. If, on the other hand, you go to a church that is not 501c and you donate money, your donation is not tax deductible. That's the main difference most people will face. Meaning, if a church were to be 501c organization, were to become involved in politics and political activism, and have the IRS enforce the Johnson Amendment and strip them of their 501c status, you have not created a situation where that church is now paying taxes. The atheist community saying if they wish to be involved in political activism, then they should be stripped of their tax exemption, are assuming the tax exemption only exists so long as they are not politically activist, when in reality their tax exemption has always existed. The tax exemption is ironically in the First Amendment. You see, the First Amendment does not mandate that churches remain silent on political issues. The First Amendment does not exist to protect people or the government from religion. It exists to protect religious bodies from the government. Just like it would be silly to say that the First Amendment exists to protect people from free speech or free press. Keep in mind, it's all one sentence in the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not say Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, period. Then follow it by a second sentence about free speech and the freedom of the press. And it certainly doesn't say Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion because religion will take over and create a theocracy. Rather, it says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, comma, and then it goes on to free speech and the free press. It is obvious that you can't read this as saying that religion should be out of government to protect the government without also saying we need to protect the government from free speech and we need to protect the government from a free press. After all, it's in the same sentence and it would be silly to say otherwise. In reality, the First Amendment exists to protect people's religious freedom. It does not exist to protect the government from religious interference. And churches have always been involved in political activism. There is, of course, a difference between a church being involved in political activism and a church taking over a government. And incidentally, if a church were to take over a government, this would not create a theocracy. A theocracy is a government in which the head of state is understood to be a god. I know that in the modern world we use the term theocracy to refer to a country governed by religion and religious clergy, but a theocracy is not a government by religion. It is a government whose head of state is a god. But that brings us back to the problem, though. Church tax exemption exists to protect churches from government interference. America's founding fathers did not look at Europe, see the centuries of wars over religion, and how when religion takes over, people are stripped of their rights, and create the First Amendment to protect the government and the people from religion. They rather saw how churches were dominated by political forces and wished to protect the religious freedom of people from the government, which is not really the same thing, and is relevant to tax issues because the power to tax is the power to control. The power to tax is the power to destroy. And we all know that the atheists don't just want churches to pay taxes, who go about saying churches are breaking the law by getting involved in politics. The members of the self-declared skeptic community want to start taxing churches so they can run them, as they put it, out of business. Because they treat churches as businesses, giving you nothing in return for your money, because they're evil con jobs. And enough atheists who think that way in government would use the power of the government to artificially punish churches by imposing heavier and stiffer taxation on them until they are forced to close. We know this because this happens in other socialist countries where this has been implemented. And there's no real difference between atheists in America who are making these claims and socialists or even communists, because the ideas all come from the 19th century free thought movement and the works of groups like the rationalist press. Incidentally, that's the real issue, because they are all drawing their ideas from the same sources. And those sources go back to the 19th century. For instance, you will frequently see a member of the self-declared skeptic community say that Christians threaten us with eternal torture. The phrase eternal torture is not found in the Bible. The phrase eternal torture is not found in any English translation of the Bible. The phrase eternal torture is not found in Christian literature. The phrase eternal torture is from Joseph McCabe and his History of Torture. Joseph McCabe wrote for the rationalist press, and his material is often cited by the American Humanist Association, by the old articles written for the Council for Secular Humanism, and for the Center for Inquiry. Sometimes they will give him credit and actually mention the name Joseph McCabe and even the books they got it from. Quite often now, though, it's become popular to not mention this because they want to pretend they've done their own research. Nevertheless, Joseph McCabe was a prolific author for the rationalist press and for various humanist and atheist groups in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Joseph McCabe is often the immediate source for a lot of the claims you see. By the way, when I say immediate source, I don't necessarily mean he is the actual source. Sometimes he is, or at least as far as I can tell, like with the eternal torture point. However, one of the reasons that McCabe was able to be a prolific author was because a lot of what he wrote was a distillation of what others in the self-declared rationalist movement had already said. So a lot of what he wrote was nothing more than a compilation and distillation of other people's work. He did produce some original work, but he also tended to copy a lot, and sometimes he would do both. He would release a book that is part his, part someone else's, or part several other people's that he simply condensed. But the benefit of Joseph McCabe, from the point of view of the American Humanist Association or other groups like it, is the fact that he provided ready reference, because instead of having to read 30 or 40 books, you can read his book and he will have the same basic statements in them. I say statements instead of facts because a lot of what he said is not factual. For example, if you go to the Freedom from Religion Foundation website, all of their Heroes of Free Thought articles that they put up are based on Joseph McCabe and his Biographical Dictionary of Modern Rationalists, or its later extensive revision and updating in 1948, later slightly revised but under the same title, and re-released in 1950, a biographical encyclopedia of modern rationalists. This is why, for example, the Freedom from Religion Foundation declares that William Lloyd Garrison was a deist and not a Christian. This goes back to McCabe and his work, which declares him a non-Christian theist. William Lloyd Garrison was, of course, a prominent abolitionist who really got the political action for abolition going, and the secular humanist organizations, who all now call themselves atheists because they don't want to admit what they really are, latch onto him as a hero for free thought. He was an atheist, or at the very least a deist, who rejected Christianity, of course, who led abolition. And of course it's used as an indictment, since Christians claim credit for abolition when it was really atheists, agnostics, and deists who fought for abolition. And of course, Christians were all for slavery, since the Christian Bible makes it clear that God condones slavery, and the Christian Bible also promotes racism, and let's not forget, the Christian Bible clearly says it's moral to own slaves and we should own slaves. It's very clearly there. So naturally Christians supported slavery because of their holy book, and no church opposed slavery until around the 1840s. The first people to oppose slavery were from the Enlightenment, based upon the rights of man, and Thomas Paine and the Age of Reason. Sometime later, a few radical Christians from liberal denominations joined the abolition cause, but it was definitely founded by atheists, agnostics, and deists motivated by the Enlightenment. And even the Christians who joined early on did not represent their denomination. Their denomination was definitely pro-slave, and the vast majority of members of their denomination were pro-slave. a small handful who were actually motivated by the Enlightenment themselves and were far closer to freethinkers than Christians, but who still, for whatever baffling, strange, bizarre reason, considered themselves Christian, even though the Christian Bible makes it clear that God condoned slavery and the Christian religion was pro-slave, still considered themselves Christian, broke off and quit from it, but it was really the atheists, agnostics, and deists who deserved the credit, the Enlightenment that deserves the credit, and we can look to atheist heroes like William Lloyd Garrison, who was either an atheist, or at the very least a deist, and who definitely rejected Christianity, was definitely motivated by the Enlightenment, who naturally fought against slavery. In reality, William Lloyd Garrison was a Christian. This is not me making it up. He definitely was. If you look up any of his speeches online, and they are all available for free, the majority of them talk about Christianity rather often and not adversely, as in, oh, the Christian religion is evil. The atheist community is often guilty of what it claims Christians do, and they will cherry pick certain quotes, but if you read the actual speeches, or the Liberator newspaper that he published, there is no way you can come to the conclusion that he hated Christianity and rejected it. The same is true of Frederick Douglass, who we are told was more of a humanist when he died, and who definitely rejected Christianity, and even said that Christian slave masters were worse than non-Christian slave masters. And of course, he praised the morality of Robert Ingersoll. Many even claim that he was close friends with Robert Ingersoll. There's no evidence that they were close friends. He didn't even praise Ingersoll's morality. Rather, he was condemning Moody's morality. Moody was a very famous Christian leader who himself stated that he was in support of abolition, but who did not wish to share the stage with Frederick Douglass, and Douglass was calling him out for his cowardice. When Douglass said of Moody that Ingersoll was more moral than him, that was meant as an insult. And the insult only works if Douglass viewed Ingersoll as immoral. And he did if you read his works. And there is no evidence that he ever renounced Christianity or hated Christianity. In fact, Frederick Douglass was very dedicated to Christianity. And Frederick Douglass died a committed Christian. You can't read his own works without coming to that conclusion. And yet, the atheist sites say that he rejected Christianity and saw it as evil, was close friends of Ingersoll, who he praised as deeply moral, and who was more of a humanist when he died, based upon no evidence at all. And they do the same thing with Susan B. Anthony, who was definitely a Christian, but they say wasn't. Or with Lucretia Mott, who was definitely a Christian, who they say wasn't. Or Garrett Smith, who was definitely a Christian, who they say wasn't. And a lot of these arguments they're getting from Joseph McCabe and his biographical dictionary. But McCabe, again, while he is the original source for some of these claims, didn't necessarily come up with all of them. Charles Bradlaugh seems to be the origin, at least as far as I can tell at this moment, of the claim that Garrison was not a Christian. Just as an example. But you will nevertheless see these claims that are from Joseph McCabe's book, because, again, they're going to it as their source, even if McCabe went to someone else as a source. And it shows up on sites like the Freedom From Religion Foundation. It shows up on sites like the Center for Inquiry and its branch, Free Thought Trails. It shows up on all of these places. And if you read the works of Charles Bradlaugh, if you read the works of George Jacob Holyoake, if you read the works of Anne Besant, you will eventually see that what they are arguing now is simply a revival of these older materials. With the exception of certain ones that would be embarrassing. Oh, don't get me wrong. They still use all of the arguments used by their predecessors, but how they use them is different. They make most of the arguments and leave some out because they would be embarrassing today. But they use the ones they leave out by claiming they were the arguments being made by Christians. A perfect example of that would be eugenics. According to the modern-day atheist society that runs secular humanism and that promotes secular humanism, it was Christians in the Christian church that promoted racism and slavery. Christians definitely promoted racism even after the American Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan is a deeply Christian organization. The Christian church is to blame for it. Even if you were to point out that the Triple K organization hated Catholics, that doesn't mean anything, since Christians have a long history of hating and fighting and killing each other. Therefore, the Catholic Church is guilty of creating the Triple K, even though the Triple K hated them because, well, they have a long history of hating each other, so somehow they're all guilty. Even though... And as we can see from these examples, it was Christians promoting racism, Christians promoting eugenics. It was atheists, agnostics, and deists who realized that eugenics was a pseudoscience and rejected it. Atheists, agnostics, and deists believed in real science like evolution, and eugenics is actually a creationist pseudoscience. You see, evolution requires you to believe in natural selection, but eugenicists don't believe natural selection exists. They believe in artificial selection, which is basically their term for intelligent design. And besides, a Christian invented eugenics, Thomas Malthus, a Christian minister, no doubt. Christians are responsible for the creation of eugenics and all of the terrors that came from it. Atheists, agnostics, and deists always recognized it as a pseudoscience. Except that's not true. Thomas Malthus was indeed a Christian minister in the Church of England, but he did not create eugenics. They say he did simply so that a Christian can take the blame for creating it. Rather, Francis Galton invented eugenics. He did not merely coin the term eugenics, which is what I will be told. He will say, he didn't create it, he just invented the term. It goes back to Malthus. Malthus never promoted selected breeding. Selected breeding is in essence what eugenics is. You pick two fit individuals to breed together to produce desired traits in the same way animal breeding would do. Because humans are animals, and you can do the same thing. You can improve humanity through selective breeding. That is the entire point of eugenics. And Thomas Malthus never promoted selective breeding. Therefore, Thomas Malthus never promoted eugenics. And it's not just that he didn't use the word eugenics. Having stated that, eugenics was actually created by Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. And it was very deeply rooted in evolutionary theory. Please don't twist my words. I am not claiming that if one believes in evolution, one must inherently be a eugenicist and thus a racist. I'm not even saying that if you believe in evolution, you must believe in eugenics. I accept the theory of evolution myself. I am not claiming it's evil. I am not claiming that people who believe in it are evil. I am not claiming that eugenics and racist policies are the inevitable result of it. But it would be silly to think that racism and eugenics had absolutely nothing to do with evolution, which is the mistake many in the self-declared skeptic community make, because they believe there's a war between science and religion, and science is reduced to nothing more than a handful of tokens, and evolution is just a token. And since evolution is true, evolution is good, therefore can never motivate evil. When in reality, any sort of belief can motivate evil. Evolution has been used to justify racism. Evolution has been used to justify eugenics. Evolution is in fact necessary for one to justify eugenics. You can't be a eugenicist unless you believe in evolution. And as much as they like touting that one guy who was a creationist who was also a eugenicist, and I can't remember his name and don't have internet access right now, the truth is that it is very odd to have him about, but it doesn't change the fact that eugenics, as understood conventionally, requires evolution. That does not mean evolution is not true. That does not mean evolution is evil. It just means that evil people based their idea on evolution. And those evil people included Charles Bradlaugh, who was a eugenicist and a racist, who believed that black people were in fact inferior to white people, and that, in fact, black people were closer to baby chimpanzees than either the baby chimpanzee or the black person would be to a white person. One of the arguments Charles Bradlaugh made against Christianity was, in fact, that according to a bishop in the Church of England, Bishop Biswick, God created life as a series of challenges to test us and to improve us and to allow us to be shaped for eternity. Bradlaugh's response to Biswick was to say that the Christian God was cruel, since he gives all men the same challenges and all men the same prize at the end, heaven. But not all men are equal. According to Charles Bradlaugh, certain people of certain races are inferior to other people. Charles Bradlaugh actually argued that Christianity was absurd since, according to Charles Bradlaugh, not me, Charles Bradlaugh, black people were closer to baby chimpanzees than either were to white people. He repeated this comparison between black people and baby chimpanzees, claiming that one was closer to another, in his debate with another minister in the Church of England called McMahon. You can look both of them up online. You can look up Charles Bradlaugh speaking in his theological essays about how black people, using the older in word that we are not allowed to use, but it is not the one you're thinking, it is the one that ends in grow, not the one that ends in er. And you can see him actually saying they are closer to baby chimps than to white people in the theological essays, or in his debate on if secularism is good for society, which he had with Reverend McMahon. You can look it up online. You can go to the Internet Archives and find it for free. I'm not making it up. Charles Bradlaugh was the racist, not the clergy of the Church of England. You can lie about it and say the clergy were the ones making all the racist arguments in pro-eugenics and Bradlaugh was appalled by it, but it was Bradlaugh making these arguments. And these arguments were also a common feature in the rationalist press. You see these arguments being made by Karl Pearson, who very plainly used science, reason, critical thinking, and evidence to prove that white people were evolutionarily superior to black people, and that the unfit, inferior races should be sent away, or perhaps sterilized and done away with. You see the same arguments being made by Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer's work was one of the primary driving forces behind the works of Madison Grant, and Madison Grant, along with Spencer himself, and along with Haeckel, were all primary influences on a certain Mr. Hissarala Lear, a man with a funny little mustache who ran the Socialists for Nationalism in Germania. Of course, the self-declared skeptic community claims that Mr. Hessa Lear was actually a devout Christian who rejected evolution, and that he was a Catholic, and that it was actually centuries of Christian euphemism. Centuries of Christian anti-Elvinism that led to the great sacrifice of burning, which, by the way, is the actual definition of the word. Forgive my substitution. This is the actual point, though. according to the mythology of the holy religion of atheism is not a religion. What you actually have is Christians hating the elves for centuries, it being official doctrine in both Catholic and Protestant churches that the elves are evil killers of Jesus, and that they are irredeemably evil and can't get saved, and that they are just bad. And after all of this, devout Christian Learhis rose to power and implemented church policies into law, and of course that included the anti-Elvinism that both the Catholic Church agreed with and Protestants. In fact, Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant Reformation, wrote a book on the elves and their lies with a 7-point plan for the elves. And the Socialists for Nationalism in Germania had a 25-point plan, which was nothing more than a revival of Luther's 7-point plan for the elves with a few new features. All of it goes back specifically to Christianity and its hatred of the elves. In fact, the Catholic Church was officially anti-elvish until its official church congress in 1965 called Vatican II, where they changed the official doctrines of the church. Well, that's stupid. For one, the Catholic Church has never had an official church congress. It's a church council. I don't care if you think that's a nitpick because it's a different word. It proves that you haven't studied history when you call it an official church congress. It's rather like listening to a mindless atheist drone trying to debunk the first cause argument by saying it's special pleading. Because if everything needs a creator, then so would God, and referring to God as the first cause creator. Whenever you hear the term first cause creator, it's a mindless atheist drone repeating garbage from an atheist website. But getting back to this point, Mr. Hezalier did not derive his anti-Elvinism from centuries of Christian anti-Elvinism. It isn't even true that the Catholic Church was officially anti-Elvish until Vatican II. In fact, the Catholic Church fought against the mistreatment of elves in the Middle Ages. Now, I'm not claiming, of course, that no Catholic ever did anything wrong to an elf. I'm really not. And I'm really tired of atheists saying that I'm saying Christians can do no wrong. It's actually the other way around. They're saying atheists can do no wrong. But I am saying that the Catholic Church did not officially teach as doctrine that the elves were evil, or that they couldn't get saved, or anything like that. And it wasn't even official church teaching in Protestantism. It may, for instance, be true that Martin Luther wrote a book on the elves and their lies, but that doesn't even prove that the Lutheran Church in Germany maintained what Luther said in that book for centuries. In fact, the book was largely obscure until the Third Kingdom of Germania, regardless of the fact that the self-declared skeptic community claims it was in common use. It wasn't. It was largely a forgotten book. And if you actually read on the elves and their lives... By the way, what I'm about to say will get me another scripted response. Oh, so that makes it okay. Spare me that. I'm not saying it makes it okay, but I am trying to explain the history. So when you inevitably repeat that stupid, oh, so that makes it okay line so that you can maintain fault-finding, basically, within Christianity and not admit you were ever wrong about anything. The simple truth of the matter is, I'm not saying what Martin Luther said was good, but it is different than what the mythology of the holy religion of atheism says. By the way, the term the holy religion of atheism is referring to your form of secular humanism that pretends it's not secular humanism and just says it's an atheism. You're going to ignore that explanation and say I called atheism a religion anyway, but I don't care at this point. You're liars, and you know the difference now. So, having said all that, the actual views that Martin Luther had were not that the elves were Jesus killers, and that the elves couldn't get saved, and that the elves were irredeemable. Rather, it's very obvious that he taught the opposite. The idea that Martin Luther had the same views as Mr. Learhis is silly. Mr. Learhis was killing atheists who were of elvish extraction. Mr. Learhis was killing Catholics who had elvish blood. Mr. Learhis had a racial motivation for killing the elves. Martin Luther, on the other hand, said that the elves should be given certain disabilities. Yes, they were very strict. Can't travel highways, can't own tools, yada yada yada. They were very bad laws, and I'm not saying they weren't. But, well, I'm actually glossing over them because I didn't have time to make separate videos, and I can't put one on Shoot Up Bits separately. But the point I'm making is that I have to kind of avoid certain issues with Al Gore, who needs to protect his rhythm. But the point I'm making here is, if you actually read Martin Luther's book on the elves and their lies, you will see that he said all of those legal disabilities would be lifted should the elves convert to Christianity. No, I am not saying that makes it okay. So when you repeat that, "Oh, so that makes it okay" line, you will be lying. But I am saying that Martin Luther did not have a race-based idea about the elves, whereas Mr. Learhis did. And therein lies the problem. Because if you actually study the history, it is very different than what they claim. It's not remotely the same. And they are getting their ideas from the 19th century free thought movement. They are getting their ideas from the same sources that promoted the racism that they are now attributing to Christianity. They are getting their information from people who are promoting eugenics. In fact, virtually all of the prominent atheist leaders promoted eugenics. Most, if not all, of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto in 1933 supported eugenics. By the way, the Humanist Manifesto in 1933 calls humanism a religion, so people who insist that humanism is not a religion, you're simply saying that so that you can implement it by law and have it taught in schools. You're not doing it because it's not a religion. And no amount of choosing a definition of religion that mandates belief in a god will work, especially if you're the sort to claim that communism is a form of religion. Which brings up a good point, though. Did you know that most, if not all, of the prominent atheists who were promoting humanism and humanist values and going about calling themselves freethinkers and rationalists in the 19th and early 20th century adored Karl Marx? Did you know that Joseph McCabe claims that Karl Marx was the father of modern socialism and that he was a great man? Did you know that he also claimed that Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was a good man who freed people from political and religious oppression under monarchy and church and gave the world a secular state? Did you know that in his volume, written while Stalin was still alive, he calls Stalin one of Europe's great statesmen? Odd, considering they now say communism was actually a form of religion and all. Isn't it? By the way, the American Humanist Association, as well as the National Secular Society, both supported the Soviet Union, and the American Humanist Association, which is largely an American form of, or even branch of, the National Secular Society in the UK, derived a lot of its funding and support from the Soviet Union through shell agencies and supported communism. Well, back in the day they did. And the signers of the Humanist Manifesto supported eugenics and socialism, which included communism. John Dietrich, Raymond Bragg. By the way, people like pointing to Raymond Bragg, claiming he was the principal author of the Humanist Manifesto and was a Unitarian minister, which means that he was a Christian who believed in God, and use him to prove that you can be a humanist and still be a Christian, and that humanism is not a religion, it is a philosophy. Raymond Bragg, as well as John Dietrich and a few others, actually took over the Unitarian Church with the hopes of shifting it from being a Christian church to being a humanist one. And they partially succeeded, since the Unitarian Church, while they never officially became atheist, did say belief in God became optional. So it's really one of those lies they like telling about history in the self-declared skeptic community, that the Humanist Manifesto was written by a Christian who believed in God. If you read Raymond Bragg's work, it's very obvious he was an atheist and he was not a Christian who believed in God. And the same goes for John Dietrich, the same goes for Erich Fromm, the same goes for a lot of them. But that brings us back to the signers of the Humanist Manifesto. Raymond Bragg promoted eugenics. John Dietrich promoted eugenics. John Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System promoted eugenics. Incidentally, so did Charles Francis Porter. For that matter, so did the other atheists, whether they signed it or not. George Bernard Shaw famously supported eugenics. So did Bertrand Russell. So did H.G. Wells. For that matter, eugenics was actually supported by H.L. Mencken, who also held deeply racist views. By the way, H.L. Mencken is the reason the word fundamentalist exists, although it is based upon a 4-volume set of 90 essays written by various Baptists mostly, and which was titled The Fundamentals, A Testimony of Truth, or just The Fundamentals if you want to be a little shorter. Mencken took the word fundamentals and turned it into fundamentalist for someone who follows the works, and today's understanding of fundamentalists as anti-intellectual and as intolerant and as hateful largely comes from H.L. Mencken. In reality, if you read the fundamentals, the people who wrote that are not hateful. They are not spiteful. They are not condemning people of other religions. They are not condemning other Christians. They are not being particularly hostile at all. And what's more, they are not anti-intellectual. Much of what they write is actually intellectually engaging. And yet, we know a fundamentalist is an anti-intellectual, and we like imagining the stereotype of a redneck hick shouting with a shotgun in the air, proverbially. All because of Mencken. And since we equate fundamentalism with any form of religion we don't like, now we have Muslim fundamentalists or Catholic fundamentalists. And the term is really overused. It's like factist is. Yes, that's a euphemism. It's a term that doesn't really mean anything and is just used to generate negative emotions. And it goes back to Mencken. But what's odd is that even though in today's world we would imagine the right-wing fundamentalist Christians as racist, and no doubt the people who wrote the fundamentals were donning their white robes of the Triple K and obviously were white supremacists and supporters of eugenics and racial supremacy, while the atheist H.L. Mencken would naturally have opposed them because he was oh so not racist. The fact of the matter is, the people who wrote the fundamentals opposed racism. So did people in the Churches of Christ, although today's atheist community can turn to Owen Morgan and his brilliant expose on the Churches of Christ as a cult, or should I say the Church of Christ as a cult, when he pointed out how it's definitely a cult, since in their worship services you just sit there and sing, and that's emotional control to the core, how the elders control every aspect of your life, how if you try to leave they'll hunt you down, how you have to obey the elders, how calling their preacher a pastor is a grievous sin, and how you're not allowed to hang out with people of other churches, and you can only talk to others or not go to college, or if you do, only go to theirs, and how awful they were. Well, the churches of Christ were such an evil, awful, fundamentalist Christian cult that we would be expected that they would be white supremacists. Yet, he told his audience when he did that expose to sit down. He gave shocking news that they opposed slavery and that they opposed racism. But these are fundamentalists who were promoting hate. They're a cult. How can this hateful cult oppose slavery? Well, if this was the real world instead of the delusional fantasy of an atheist who hates Christianity, then even if what he was saying were true about the Church of Christ, you could say that even though they're evil, that doesn't mean they embrace all evil. But that's not good enough. For the self-declared skeptic community, this cult who tells you you're not allowed to be friends with anyone not in the cult, whose elders control everything you do, who hunt you down if you try and leave, if you switch congregations you become a pariah, who emotionally manipulate you by making you sit there and sing, and who tell you you shouldn't get a higher education unless it's through their institutions. This cult who controls every aspect of your life is obviously evil, so therefore they would obviously believe literally the Bible, and they are biblical literalists, meaning they're creationists, for crying out loud. They're creationists. Then they must believe the parts of the Bible that God condones slavery. So they naturally would have supported slavery and racism, but he told people to bear for the shock, and the shock was they opposed slavery, they opposed segregation, and they opposed racism. And they refused to segregate their own churches. This is shocking! How could these evil people do that? Don't worry, Owen Morgan had an answer for you. And that answer is, they were just like what he grew up in the Jehovah's Witness, and the only reason they opposed slavery or segregation or racism wasn't because they didn't believe in them. They most certainly did. The Bible very clearly condoned slavery, and these biblical literalist fundamentalist cult would have done so too. But they realized there was a greater need to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate. So they set aside racism and their support for slavery in order to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate. They were really just as racist as all the others. In fact, they were worse. A church that was openly racist is at least being honest about it, but these people are lying about being not racist. Just like modern evangelicals lie to Jews by pretending to be their friends, when in reality they hate Jews and want to send them to Israel so they can make the end of the world happen, so that Jesus will come back, kill all the Jews, and send them to hell. The Church of Christ was racist and believed in slavery, but lied about it, claiming not to be, to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate. Of course, Owen Morgan presented absolutely no evidence for that, and if I tell you that's not true, then I have made a claim that they were not racist and did not believe in slavery and were not just shifting the hate to the outsider and the apostate, and the burden of proof is on me since I made the claim and Owen Morgan didn't. Owen Morgan telling us that they are just like the Jehovah's Witness, and the only reason they oppose slavery and segregation and racism was to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate, is not making a claim. Owen Morgan is an atheist. By definition, atheism is a lack of belief in a God. So when Owen Morgan says the Church of Christ is just like the Jehovah's Witness, and that they only oppose slavery, segregation, and racism to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate, he is not making any claims, and he has no burden of proof. You see, that's kind of how they operate. They like saying things they have no evidence for, and then demanding you believe it unless you can prove it wrong, and the burden of proof is always on the religious person, which means Christian. And of course, this isn't true. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Church of Christ secretly supported slavery and segregation and racism. There is no reason to believe that when they read the Bible they weren't taking literally the parts about slavery, and they just didn't understand it the way that the modern day holy religion of atheism is not a religion do. And there is no reason to think that Churches of Christ, by the way, it's actually Churches of Christ, not Church of Christ, he got the name wrong. No, that is not a nitpick. The atheist community gets a lot of things wrong and then attacks me for randomly capitalizing words. So it's not a nitpick. And they get these facts wrong so they can demonize them with no evidence. There's no reason to think they were secretly supporting slavery and segregation and racism, and only pretended not to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate, other than the fact that Owen Morgan said so. And considering I grew up in the Churches of Christ and can tell you that the elders did not control everything I did, we were never told we couldn't be friends with people outside the church. Most people were, in fact. There were even a few that were married to people who went to different churches. No one became a pariah for switching congregations. Sitting there and singing a cappella music is not just sit there and sing, and is not emotional control of the core. In fact, the Churches of Christ aren't very emotional. It is true they don't call their preachers pastors, but that's because they're not pastors. They don't, however, think of it as a grievous sin to do so, and they're not going to punish them for calling them pastor. It's just wrong. A pastor, by the way, is a spiritual authority, the man who runs the congregation and who everyone else submits to, and that's why the Churches of Christ don't call the preacher a pastor. The Churches of Christ don't have pastors, and it's not just a job title difference. The preacher does not have greater authority in the Churches of Christ, than anyone else. The idea that a preacher is the same thing as a pastor is silly if you actually try and understand it. But therein lies the point, because they want to create an image where churches are evil, and the conservative ones are the most evil, and they have this very simplistic view, and they are perfectly willing to rewrite history to do it. But they ultimately rely on this predetermined historical narrative that from time to time gets revised and updated, but that ultimately is based on 19th century free thought movement literature you find in the rationalist press. And therein lies the problem. You see, the way it transmitted to the modern world is that they wrote about it in the 19th and early 20th century. The organizations formed around this literature, and the ideas and works that were produced were then used as the source materials for the articles written by these organizations, which also responded to various situations in the world and what other people were saying. And over time, they keep repeating the same narratives and the same claims, and it became doctrine. And when the new atheism came along, all it did was revive these arguments and popularize them. Incidentally, the new atheism was largely astroturf to begin with, since it was not an organic movement of 4 individual people who came out of nowhere and published books. They all published through the same publisher. They all published using the same literary agent, and that literary agent worked for a certain Jeff Epstein. The name has been butchered because I can't say it. So as you can see, there's this even transmission of history. And that is exactly how the new atheism came about. That is what the modern atheist movement is doing. All they're doing is repeating old nonsensical gibberish from the 19th century from people who were never reliable sources in the first place. I don't have much else to say, but I will say this in closing. I'm going to do probably several more videos on this topic in the future, but I'm going to do one more video on this topic in the immediate future before branching onto other topics, both relating to the modern atheist movement and not. But I did want to present a more clean, more valid version, I suppose, than the ones that I presented earlier. This one is still a bit rambling. I'm still trying to perfect the delivery so that I can get by the system. But I do think this is an important message, so I do think repeating it isn't that bad. Still, I'm going to take my leave of you now. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye.